Most casual students of ancient history probably couldn't locate Aigina on a map, but they may recognize that it sounds vaguely Greek, so they might get lucky. Most students of classical Greece in particular only really know Aigina as an early foe of democratic Athens, an island nation that the Athenians were able to best before moving on to challenge Persia, Sparta, and Macedon. However, the Aigintans were a proud and important people in Greek history, and their history is an interesting one, worthy of study in its own right. In this video, I would like to look at Aiginetan history from the Archaic and Classical period especially, but also with some thought for their mythological past, and for a little bit of their history during the Byzantine period as well. So we'll be looking at not only their political history as it developed, but also a little bit at some physical remains, such as the coins that the Aigintans minted, and also the remains of a couple of their major temples which are still standing. First of all, let's consider the geography of Aigina. Aigina is more or less in the dead center of the Saronic Gulf. It is about 17 miles south of Attica, and perhaps a bit closer to the coast of the northern Peloponnese. The mother city of Aigina is supposedly Epidaurus on the far eastern side of the Peloponnese, so probably pretty near to the island of Poros or the island of Hydra that you can see on the map. However, the relationship between Epidaurus and Aigina is not terribly well documented and doesn't seem to have had a very big impact economically or otherwise. The island of Aigina is only 9.3 miles long east to west and about 6.2 miles in length north to south. The north and the western sections of the island are rich farmland, but the south is rocky and not very suitable for agriculture. The north and the west, however, are not only decent farmland, but apparently they are high yield, and this would have given the island a solid agricultural basis from which to grow and begin to prosper. Pausanias, the travel writer, also informs us that it was considered to be one of the most unapproachable islands in the Greek world, with rocks underwater or just breaking the surface all around it. Apparently only on the west side of the island, where the city of Aigina itself was located, was there a decent harbor for the Aigintans to establish their primary port, where they kept their fleet, and also what would become the capital city of this island polis. Aiginetan's self-identity was a somewhat complex thing. On the one hand, the Aigintans accepted that they were a colony, or at least a daughter city, of Epidaurus. On the other hand, however, they believed that their history dated back a long time before the arrival of the Epidaurians. The story goes, according to Aiginetan legend, that Zeus had once impregnated and abducted a young woman named Aigina. This was, of course, hardly the only time he had done something like this. He apparently wanted to avoid the disapproval of Aigina's parents, so instead of giving them money or giving them some divine favor that would keep them happy, he decided instead to remove the girl from her home and relocate her to the unoccupied island of Oinoe. This island was a lonely place at the time, and after some time had passed, Aigina's son decided to rename the island after his mother, so the island of Oinoe became the island of Aigina. It was often thought that a polis, or a certain landmass, would be female in nature, so it kind of makes sense to name a place after a mother figure. In his case, it was literally his mother. So Aigina's son Aeacus was ruling over this little island, and at one point he got bored and he asked Zeus for people that he could rule over. Zeus therefore raised people from the local ants. The word for ants in Greek is myrmidons. Of course, you may have heard this word before if you're familiar with Homer's Iliad. At one point, Aeacus had 3 sons. 2 of them murdered another. So he exiled 2 of those sons. One of them, named Peleus, took some of the myrmidons with him to the city of Phthia on the mainland. Later on, Peleus would pass the throne to his son Achilles, and Achilles would take these Myrmidons, or at least their descendants, with him to Troy. So Aiginetan myth is something that was more or less widely accepted by a lot of the neighboring polis of Greece. So in this way, they're quite unlike Corinth, where their local mythology was often disputed by their neighbors. There are many times when Greek polis will make grandiose claims about what they did in the mythological age, and often that is not backed up by any kind of archaeological evidence of a great civilization flourishing there during the time of the Minoans or Mycenaeans. In the case of Aigina, however, it does have receipts, and its talk of autochthony is not quite as absurd as it may sound on its face. The island was occupied by the Minoans as early as 2000 BCE. Between 1850 and 1550 BCE, one or more Minoans living on the island of Aigina decided to create a treasure hoard. In this treasure hoard were several very valuable objects, the chief among them being this dedication on your screen to some unknown goddess. After the Mycenaean civilization collapsed around 1100 BCE, Aigina continued to show stronger signs of Mycenaean-style artifacts than nearly any of its neighbors in the Saronic Gulf region. This has led many scholars to speculate that Aigina was a kind of holdout, a place where the Mycenaeans retreated and maintained their way of life to a higher degree than they did elsewhere. In the 9th century, this may have been when Epidaurus dispatched its colony and spread mainstream Dorian culture to the island, which then displaced the earlier Mycenaean holdout culture. Of course, much of this is speculative, since we don't have very convincing or decisive evidence on this matter. Oftentimes, as is the case in Greek history, that we have rather random pieces of evidence from the early Archaic period recorded in literary sources. However, the literary sources rarely, if ever, fully explain these things, and our archaeological picture is not so developed that it can really help flesh this out or make sense of it. One of these scraps is the Amphictyony. This is also known as the League of Calaria, and it was formed in the 8th or perhaps the 7th century. Effectively, the Amphictyony is a kind of religious community where neighboring polis would band together for a common purpose. They would sometimes celebrate a festival together or exchange sacred goods. So if one place had a kind of wood that was needed to make idols or something like that, then they would set up a formalized relationship with the neighbor in order to make sure this trade occurred. We know about the religious aspects of these much better than we do other reasons for their existence. There also were at least 2 other Amphictyonies in existence at a later time. However, this League of Calaria was one which met on the little island of Calaria right off the coast of Treason. So this is just right off the coast of the northern Peloponnese. And apparently they had celebrations that they did there. There was a temple to Poseidon. You can see a few of the remaining stones in front of the large tree here. This is from the island of Calaria. Some scholars also speculate that the Amphictyony had other purposes outside of the strictly religious, that it also served as a kind of defensive league against piracy, or perhaps against Argive aggression under the tyrant Phaidon. Some scholars reject the idea of it being a defensive alliance against Phaidon, since Phaidon most likely lived decades or perhaps as much as a century after this Amphictyony was formed. At any rate, though, we do know that this was a real organization and that it did have religious significance. What other points of significance it had are, at this point, more or less purely speculative. Aigina, despite its small size, was for a time the leading trade power in the western Aegean Sea. Its importance is reflected in the fact that Aigina has the distinction of being the first European polis, or first European power of any description, to mint its own coinage. It did so a mere 30 or 40 years after its Greek cousins and the Lydians did so in Anatolia. The Aiginetan silver stater became one of the standard coin values of the Aegean region from the 7th century forward into the 4th century. While normally exchanges took place in later periods according to Athenian standards, the Aiginetan standard was still one that people recognized and often used. Before the Attic standard really took off, however, the Aiginetan standard was the one that people adhered to by and large. A silver stater was a large denomination coin which would have weighed 12.3 grams. It would have been made mostly of electrum at first, but in later periods it would have been of just silver. Each of these staters could be broken up into 3 smaller coins called drachmas, and each drachma would weigh 4.1 grams. After 404, the Aiginetans would abandon their iconic sea turtle design and instead embrace a land tortoise. It was during the time of the sea turtle design, however, when Aigina was one of the major powers in the Greek world, and when they were setting the standard for weights and measurements in the Archaic period. The power of Aigina's sea trade should be quite obvious from the power of Aiginetan turtles. However, there is another piece of evidence which shows that Aigina's status was recognized by others even outside the Greek world. At Naucratis in Egypt, there was a major emporium. This is kind of a permanent trade center, which isn't quite a city. Here, the pharaoh of Egypt during the late period would allow the Greeks to trade and interact with the local economy. However, the Greeks were constricted and forced to only act in ways which were approved by the Egyptian authorities. There were 12 polis which were officially granted access to Naucratis and which had a kind of neighborhood or camp there. And of those 12, 11 were from Anatolia. Now, some of the ones from Anatolia technically were not from the mainland, such as Samos, which is an island, but they were from that general region. They were from the Lydian orbit. The one exception to that was Aigina, the only power to come from the western Aegean region. This would give Aigina a major leg up on its competitors, and it also meant that the Aiginetans had more access to Egyptian culture and technology than did many of their peers. So this in itself is a major achievement, and no doubt this would have given Aiginetan merchants a leg up on their Corinthian and Athenian competitors, both in terms of importing Egyptian goods and also dealing with the Greeks of Anatolia, who they would have some kind of closeness with due to the fact they all interacted in Naucratis, and that they therefore would have taken the Aiginetans a little more seriously than the other Western powers in Greece. During the Archaic, Aigina really prospered, and it was able to engage in monumental building projects. Perhaps its best known structure during antiquity was the Temple of Aphaia. Aphaia was a local deity in Aigina who is more or less unattested anywhere else. A mother goddess, Aphaia seems to date back to perhaps the 14th century. My guess is that Aphaia may be some kind of holdover from the Minoans, who was then integrated into Greek myth on a local level, and her origins were more or less forgotten over time. From all appearances, there was an attempt to build an early temple around 700. This would have been in place of earlier, very bare altars. Whether this temple around 700 existed or not, we know that there was a major temple building project around 570, which resulted in a structure, some little pieces of which have survived. This, however, was destroyed by an earthquake. And then the current temple, which is pictured here, was completed around 500 BCE. Later on, the Athenians would equate Aphaia to Athena, Artemis, and the nymph Britomaris. Apparently, the Athenians weren't quite sure exactly who Aphaia was, but they wanted to cover their bases by naming pretty much every goddess who wasn't named Hera. Despite some scholarly speculation about Aigina's early activities, we don't really know very much about the political history of Aigina on the international stage. Some scholars have speculated that the Aigintans got themselves involved in the Lelantine War for control of Euboea. This is the large island just to the northeast of Attica. Certainly is within the range of Aiginetan interest, but we don't really know if they did anything of that sort. I've read at least one scholar who thinks that the Aigintans may have fought a brief war against the Samians, but the evidence for that is rather slim. What we do know in much greater detail is the rivalry that Aigina carried on with the Athenians. The clash started at some point in the early to mid 6th century, and the story in Herodotus is something about how the Athenians had an agreement with the Aigintans to trade olive wood for an Aiginetan product of some sort. Perhaps it was just a blessing or a finished product that had a religious value. And at some point, the Aigintans supposedly just refused to uphold their end of the bargain, so the Athenians accordingly refused to provide the olive wood. It has been noted on many occasions that Herodotus is unapologetically pro-Athenian, so his version of events most likely was not one that Aiginetan historians would agree with. At any rate, though, we see that this is supposedly the beginning of the troubles between these two powers. Realistically, there could have been an issue with trade. Aigina as an island would rely heavily on imports to keep doing what it does. It would rely on places like Attica for timber and other resources, so it's not unreasonable to think that there is a little grain of truth here. It's also true that, so far as we can tell, Athens began to expand and it was beginning to have more interest at sea. A larger commerce was producing more pottery, and there were privately owned ships out of Attica which were doing trade all over. Also, by the time of the Pisistridids, starting around 550 or so, Athens does seem to have developed a small state navy, which then may have come into conflict a little bit with Aigina's. The real conflict, though, seems to start quite a bit later with the democratic revolution at Athens. This would have occurred in 508 or 507, and the man responsible for the reforms was Cleisthenes, pictured here. You may notice this is the same as the avatar I use for this channel. The bust of Cleisthenes was commissioned by the state of Ohio in the early 19th century for the Ohio State House, and it is not actually an ancient bust. If you notice, the eyes are blue rather than the normal faded color we see with ancient statuary. At any rate, the ruling oligarchy at Aigina decided that Athenian democracy could not be a positive development. Most of Athens' neighbors kind of freaked out and responded to the pleas of the aristocratic factions who had been ousted from power by this revolution. Aigina also was allied with Thebes at the time, and the Thebans had tried to mount a counter-revolution on behalf of Isagoras or one of the other contestants, and the Athenians had defeated him, so Aigina, to honor its agreements with Thebes, then began raiding Attica. Low-key, though, it's also very possible that the Aigintans just wanted a good excuse to gain some plunder, so they used the excuse that they had to help out the Thebans. It seems that after this point, the Athenians and Aigintans probably patched things up and this incident blew over. The Athenians fully established their democracy around 506 or so when Cleomenes, the king of Sparta, marched in, took over the Acropolis, and then rather than submitting to his will, the Athenians instead rose up as one and laid siege to the Spartans in the Acropolis, forcing them to surrender. And then after that point, it became clear to everyone that democracy was here to stay, both in Athens and throughout Attica. This is also about the time when the Athenians really synoikeize and really unify all of Attica. At any rate, though, it does appear that Athens and Aigina would not be friends in the early years of the democracy. Around 499 or so, there was the Ionian revolt against Persia. Many of the Greek cities in Anatolia decided to revolt against their overlords, and this would last for about 5 years. The Athenians happily voted to send 20 triremes to aid the Ionian revolt, and this would inspire the ire of the Persian king Darius, who later wanted to gain his revenge on the Athenians and other Greeks. It would appear that the oligarchs on Aigina were not terribly amused by Athens' actions, and that they had no intention of ever suffering any negative consequences for Athenian foolhardiness. In 491, prior to the expedition which culminated in the Battle of Marathon, the Persians sent ambassadors throughout the Greek world to seek submission by the offer of earth and water. Any powers which submitted to Persia in this way, which was mostly symbolic, were then granted immunity and mercy from the Persian army which was to come. Aigina, for its part, thought that this was a perfectly fair offer to trade their safety for a little bit of earth and water, and therefore they submitted to Persia. Perhaps their decision was heavily influenced by the fact that Persian interest in Greece had been sparked by their rival Athens, and they wanted nothing to do with a cause that was associated with the Athenians. Athens, however, decided that the Aigintans had Medized, that is to say that they had betrayed Greece and what it means to be a Greek. So Athens turned to Sparta and its old nemesis King Cleomenes I. Cleomenes, however, had not held a grudge against the Athenians, and he agreed that Medizing was unacceptable. Back in Sparta, the Spartans had famously kicked the Persian ambassador into a well, which was a violation of religious custom, and this, of course, meant that Sparta had more or less declared war on Persia. So Cleomenes mounted 2 expeditions to Aigina. The first one was broken up by his rival king, who he later then had exiled. Cleomenes then organized a second expedition, went to Aigina, captured it, and managed to remove the leading oligarchs from power. This meant that the remaining oligarchs were favorable to the Greek cause. However, this did not make the leaders of Aigina any more pro-Athenian. They seem to have held Athens responsible for Cleomenes' intervention, and there would be more or less a continuous naval war down until 481, excuse me. Siege warfare in ancient Greece prior to the innovations of Philip and Alexander was a difficult affair, and it was highly unlikely that an army would be able to take a fortified area unless someone from inside betrayed their countrymen and admitted the enemy. This is something that the history of the 5th century bears out very clearly. The Athenians were masters of siege warfare, at least they were within a couple of decades, but even they were often not successful or simply did not have the resources to invest in lengthy blockades and deployments required to take even a small polis on the fringes of their empire. At any rate, the Athenians seem to have figured out early on that the easiest way to defeat an enemy was not by direct force, but rather by appealing to factions within the city which might be favorable. Aigina had long been an oligarchy, and in fact, throughout its entire known history, it remained so. However, as with pretty much every Greek polis, there were other people who thought that the constitution should be organized differently. Almost every Greek polis would have both an oligarchic and a democratic faction. Sometimes these factions would be differently weighted, but the general dynamic was the same. In each case, both factions will be willing and in some cases happy to take outside help in order to kill and replace their political rivals. Athens found such a man in the form of the Aiginetan politician Nikodromos, who was the leader of the democratic faction in Aigina. Given how solidly entrenched the oligarchic faction was, it was highly unlikely that Nikodromos would be able to ever institute democracy. Perhaps he dreamt of becoming the Cleisthenes of Aigina. The plan was for Nikodromos to lead a revolt in the streets, which the Athenians would then assist by having 70 triremes arrive and then presumably offload a bunch of men. However, it appears that either the Aiginetan authorities found out about this coup early on and squelched it, or else the Athenians were simply late. Herodotus seems to suggest the Athenians were simply late, but most likely it was the former. At any rate, though, Athens' 70 triremes did arrive after the Aiginetan oligarchs had put down Nikodromos, and a battle was fought. The implication is that the battle was most likely fought on land, and the Athenians were able to emerge victorious. However, without a fifth column in place to let them into the city, they couldn't really do much with that victory, so they departed. Later on, the two sides fought a naval battle, and it appears the Aiginetans were able to emerge victorious from that. There apparently were other naval battles, and in most cases the Aiginetans were the victors. The previous sequence of trying to work out a coup from within by appealing to either a democratic or oligarchic faction, this is something that Athens and Sparta would do to one another repeatedly throughout the 5th century and especially in the Peloponnesian War. This was also something that other Greek powers would do in the 4th century. So this became the standard way to resolve a siege, is by looking for a fifth column to open the gates or to coup from within while there's a threat from without. It appears that the war between Aigina and Athens carried on for the remainder of the 480s, and that for the most part the Aiginetans, despite being much weaker, were able to emerge victorious time and again in the various naval clashes that the two powers had. Athens, of course, was much more populous and could absorb losses easier. Ultimately, the victory would have to go to Athens, but it could be years and years before this happened. The Athenian statesman Themistokles was worried about Aigina, but mostly he wanted Athens to strengthen its fleet because he knew that Persia would be back. For the last couple of years, there have been rumblings that the new great king Xerxes was eager to avenge his father's failure in Greece and prove himself by conquering all of Greece in the name of Persia. Themistocles, however, could not convince his fellow Athenians to invest heavily in the navy. That is until 483, when everything changed. That year, the Athenians struck a rich vein of silver at Laurion. Themistocles was finally able to convince the demos to use this money in order to build 200 new triremes. However, when he sold it to the people, he didn't talk about Persia. He had talked about Persia so much in the past that people thought maybe he was a little loony, but he did instead sell the program as being a naval building program that would enable Athens to finally rid itself of the troublesome Aiginetans. Supposedly, Themistocles allotted money for 200 triremes. However, most modern scholars think that Athens already had 70 or more ships on hand, and that in fact Themistocles only authorized the building of about 100 new ships. There may have been more than 100 ships built, but we have to remember that the average lifespan of any given trireme was around 20 years, so many of the new ships that would have been built would have been replacements rather than entirely new ships, and therefore it would not have really enlarged the navy to any significant degree. So I think we can say safely that without the threat of Aigina, it would have been very difficult for Themistocles to sell this policy to Athens. Without the threat of Aigina in the immediate future, the Athenians would have accepted the rival proposal, which was effectively to create something like a UBI for the Athenian citizens by giving out part of this revenue to them on an annual or other basis. So it is thanks to the skill of the Aiginetans, who are continually able to tweak the noses of the Athenians in naval battles, that the Athenians decided to spend all of their newfound silver on ships, and that they had 180 triremes available in 480 with which to oppose the Persians. If we backtrack to the time of Cleomenes I of Sparta and his intervention in Aigina, it's unclear exactly what he did, but apparently it was effective. In 481, when reports began to arrive of Xerxes' impending invasion of Greece, Athens and Aigina agreed to put their differences aside and focus on fighting the common enemy of Persia. The two of them would remain at peace for around 20 years after this event. We have to keep in mind what kind of navy Aigina had at this time. The Aiginetan navy was not exactly large, it was only around 30 triremes. However, these were triremes manned by men who had fought together against vastly superior odds, that being the Athenian ships, and they had held their own. Aigina had not surrendered to Athens, but rather the two had agreed to put their differences aside in order to fight the war. It's also possible that the Athenians had built many of their ships after this truce, and therefore the numerical advantage had not been fully felt. That being said, we also have to keep in mind that Athens definitely had an edge in the last year or so of their conflict, and that Athens was building new and possibly slightly more advanced ships than what the Aiginetans had available. So the Aiginetans may have been at a technological disadvantage. They most likely had fewer facilities for maintenance. Their ships were older. So they were doing all of this against superior numbers of Athenians with worse ships and fewer of them. So if we go into the Battle of Salamis in 480, we see that Herodotus tells us Aigina contributed 30 triremes, the third most of any Greek power. Second place belongs to Corinth, of course, with their 40 ships. There are some scholars who believe that Herodotus' pro-Athenian bias may have led him to downplay the number of Aiginetan ships and or the number of ships manned by the Aiginetans. The Athenians at Salamis had 180 ships that were manned by Athenians. However, it appears they had another 20 or so ships which they lent out to other Greeks because they didn't have the manpower to man them themselves. Perhaps some of the Aiginetans filled out a few of those vessels. In addition, we have to think about something else when we're talking about who had the best ships available for this battle. Now, while the Aiginetan ships probably had more wear and tear than their Athenian counterparts, Athenian ships would have been somewhat watered down in terms of crew quality because many men, especially men of wealthier census classes, had never participated in the earlier naval battles with the Aiginetans. So many of the people on board the Athenian ships at the oars were people who didn't really have a lot of experience. The Aiginetan ships, by contrast, were full of men who had fought together in the past against long odds and were doing what they did at Salamis. They also had more experience as a whole, and by and large, their conduct in the battle seems to bear out that they were of a general higher quality as a crew. After the battle, when the Greeks had won the day, they voted for honors, both for individuals and for contingents. The Greeks voted to award first place for Aristeia, or excellence/courage, to the Aiginetans, who by and large fought like lions at Salamis. The first place for individual honor went to the Athenian Themistokles, but then only by technicality, since every Greek ship captain actually voted for himself, and then all of them gave the second place vote to Themistokles. For 20 or so years after the conclusion of the Persian Wars, Athens and Aigina were at peace. This was largely due to the fact that Athenian attention was focused in the east against Persia as Athens began to build its empire and to claim territories from Persian control. It was also due to the fact that many of Athens' leading politicians at this time, including Cimon, who was pretty dominant in the late 460s, was generally opposed to any kind of hostility towards Sparta or any of Sparta's allies. However, this would all change when Cimon was ostracized in 461 due to his rejection at the hands of the Spartans who suspected him of trying to encourage further Helot revolts. This then made the Athenians think that Cimon was a fool to trust Sparta, and that he had been rebuffed because of his own foolishness. The so-called First Peloponnesian War occurred between 460 and 445, and ostensibly this was the precursor for the Peloponnesian War, but unlike that conflict, Sparta was only involved coincidentally. Sparta was still pretty weakened from the Helot revolt of the 460s, the one where they had rejected Chimon's help, and they didn't want to get involved directly. Also, much of this conflict didn't really involve Spartan interest, and they were hoping it would blow over. The First Peloponnesian War is mostly Athenian aggression against Sparta's allies, Thebes and Corinth. However, Aigina was perhaps the biggest victim of Athenian ambition during this conflict. At some point between 458 and 456, the Athenians conquered Aigina and reduced it to a mere tribute-paying ally. Aigina, once a proud power in the Western Aegean, was now a mere tribute-paying ally, no more notable than any of the other little yellow dots in the Aegean Sea you see on your map here. This must have been a sad fate for them, given how heroic they had been at the Battle of Salamis and how they had been the great rivals of Athens for so long. Now they were merely just helping to fund the Athenian fleet. They themselves most likely were not allowed to maintain a fleet, since the Athenians could not risk such a hostile force being in existence. According to the terms of the 30 Years' Peace, which Athens and Sparta eventually brokered in 445, Athens was supposed to allow Aigina its autonomy, but instead the Athenians remained in power and they kept extracting tribute. Later on in 431, when the war broke out, one of the first actions that Athens took was to boot the Aigintans from their own homeland in order to avoid having a hostile base so close to Attica. They then resettled Aigina with Cleruchs. These are Athenian settlers who retained their Athenian citizenship and divided up the land amongst themselves for farming. Aigina was fairly rich farmland, as we mentioned, so this was a great day for poor Athenians who wanted to become prosperous farmers, but it was not such a great day for the Aigintans, who now found themselves men without a homeland. Both major hegemonic powers, Athens and Sparta, did everything in their power in 431 to demonstrate their goodwill toward their allies. Athens, for its part, was straining to try to maintain the independence and safety of the Plataean people who were being threatened with destruction by their Boeotian neighbors. For its part, Sparta decided that it had to help the Aigintans. Sparta decided to resettle them at the site of Thyreatis. This city is located in the northern part of Canuria, an area that Argos and Sparta often contested, and the idea here was to locate the Aigintans in such a place where they would be able to potentially aid Spartan efforts to hold on to this area in the event of another challenge from Argos. Argos's treaty with Sparta was set to expire in 418, and Sparta was looking ahead. At this time, many Spartans thought the Peloponnesian War wouldn't last that long, and they still regarded Argos as the greater long-term threat when compared with Athens. However, unfortunately for the Aigintans settled in Thyreatis, the city would not be immune from Athenian raiding. One of the strategies that Athens pursued was to raid the Peloponnese and hit Sparta's allies to show how Sparta was not able to protect them and try to raise discontent with the war. In 424, the Athenian general Nicias raided and was able to kill many of the Aigintans at Thyreatis. The site of Thyreatis is more famous as the site of the Battle of Champions in 546 between Sparta and Argos. This is the famous battle where 300 men on each side fought each other. The Argives had 2 people survive. They then congratulated themselves and went home, and then a bloodied Spartan arose dazed from the mist, and he claimed victory for his side. So the site of Thyreatis is pretty interesting, but the Aiginetan occupation of it was unfortunately not a happy one, as a pretty significant portion of the Aigintans ended up getting killed by the Athenians in a raid which turned out to be far more successful for Nicias than he could have ever hoped. In 404, Sparta finally defeated Athens and concluded the Peloponnesian War. Part of Sparta's ostensible reason for getting engaged in this war in the first place was to bring freedom to the Greeks, i.e. end Athenian tyranny and the tribute-paying empire that Athens had had in the Aegean Sea. One of the moves that Sparta made under the general Lysander was to restore the Aigintans to their home island. The Aigintans celebrated their return home by issuing a new coin. This time they traded in the sea turtle for the land tortoise, and this would remain their coin emblem for the rest of their history. However, Aigina would never again do anything noteworthy as an independent polis. Most likely their trade networks with the East had been severed or superseded by their neighbors, and Aigina would never again be able to become a dominant trading partner. They also never really seem to have had much real independence politically. If they had autonomy, they certainly weren't able to really do anything interesting on the international scene. They certainly never conquered any of their neighbors or something like that. During the Byzantine period, the island of Aigina would have a few interesting things happen, however. During the 9th century CE, the island was beginning to prosper as the Greek world recovered, and there's quite a bit of evidence of new churches and things being built there. However, the Emirate of Crete was established to the south, and pirates from Crete were then able to wreak havoc on Aigina and end its prosperity for quite a while. During the 12th century, things had gotten worse on Aigina, and the Bishop of Athens, Michael Choniatis, writes that Aigina had become a major pirate base, along with some of the other nearby islands, and that pirates from these islands were raiding the Greek mainland on the regular. During the 2nd century CE, the travel writer Pausanias visited Aigina, and at this time most of its grand structures were still standing. However, it had long become a sleepy town. He says that not far from the harbor, there were 3 major shrines. By shrines in this case, he means temples, not mere altars. One was to Apollo. It is the one pictured on your screen. There's only one column remaining from this temple to Apollo. There's also a temple to Dionysus, but this one has been largely lost. There aren't really too many remains of that. There was also a temple to Aphrodite. However, this seems to have been a misunderstanding on Pausanias' part, and this was actually a temple to Aphaia. The chief goddess in Pausanias' time on the island of Aigina was Hecate, and she had a mystery cult which was celebrated every year. Supposedly, and similar to the mystery cult at Eleusis, this was supposedly a cult which was founded originally by Orpheus of Thrace, the famous Orpheus who had to leave his love behind in Hades. Pausanias also tells us about a large structure called the Aigion, which dominates the view as you emerge from the harbor up into the main city. He says that the Aigion was a square enclosure with walls of white stone, which protected some extremely old olive trees that were inside. This had been built supposedly to honor Zeus and protect against drought. Part of Aiginetan mythology is that this was originally a desert island until Zeus decided to make it habitable for Aigina and her son Aeacus. And here we end our discussion of Aigina. We'll end on a high note when Aigina was still semi-prosperous and had its monumental architecture in place, even if its primary temple was by this point misunderstood. Until next time, I'm Thyreatis the Historian.